Hey folks, because I get a fair few questions about ear stretching, I figured it would be a good idea for me to make some videos about it and give you all the information you need in order to stretch your ears properly. This will be a 5-part series with a new episode uploaded every single day this week. Each episode will focus on a different topic and every single video is going to contain really important information, so please watch the whole series and don't just skip to the video where I talk about how to stretch your ears, because then you're going to miss out on some really important information and that could land you in trouble later on down the track when you start stretching and didn't have all the information that you needed. So I want to start off this series by saying well done and thank you to everyone who watches this series, because that means you are taking the intelligent and responsible approach to ear stretching. You are actively educating yourself and making sure you know what the fuck you're doing, and I appreciate and respect that. This episode is basically an introduction to ear stretching. What is it? How is it done? Addressing some myths and misconceptions surrounding the process, as well as a few warnings about the things that can go wrong if you don't stretch your ears properly. So this isn't the most exciting episode, but it is really important that you know all of this information. Okay, so something that I need to get out of the way right off the bat so that we can just move on afterwards. My ears are not gauged. I am not wearing gauges in my ears and I did not get them to this size by gauging them. Please do not use the word gauge in any of those contexts, because that is incorrect terminology, and speaking that way just makes you look like someone who doesn't know what they're talking about. The word gauge has two meanings. As a noun, it means a unit of measurement, and as a verb, it means to measure something. The only times you should be using the word gauge in reference to stretched ears is when you're either referring to the size of the jewelry worn in stretched ears, so like a 2 gauge or an 8 gauge or 00 gauge, etc., or if you're talking about literally measuring your ears. So to fix my earlier statements using correct terminology, my ears are stretched. The jewelry I wear in them have various different names, and we'll get into that in the next episode, and I got them to this size by stretching them. I think we're all clear on that now? Yes? Good, okay. What is piercing stretching and how does it work? Inside a healed piercing, there is what's called a fistula, which is simply a tube of scar tissue. And stretching the piercing quite obviously involves gradually stretching or expanding that fistula or tube of scar tissue. And it is also important to remember that scar tissue is not as elastic or stretchy as normal skin, which is why it's so important that you have to stretch a piercing slowly and properly. Depending on how large you're wanting to stretch a certain piercing, it is a very, very long and time-consuming process. So don't be expecting to go from normal earring studs to a 00 gauge in 3 months, because that's not going to happen, or at least it shouldn't happen if you're doing it properly. I'm going to talk more about healing times, or the amount of time that you should wait between stretches, in episode 4, but just realize right off the bat that this process requires a lot of time and patience. Now, the misconception that I hear about ear stretching all the time is that stretching your ears hurts. This is 100% incorrect. If stretching a piercing hurts, or if it starts to bleed, it means you are doing it wrong. If you're stretching your ears correctly, it might feel a bit uncomfortable, might feel a bit tight, but it should never hurt. It's really important that you take ear stretching seriously, because it is not a risk-free process, especially if you're doing it incorrectly. If you stretch your ears using improper jewelry or tools or methods, or just not waiting long enough between upsizes, you can run into some very major and even permanent complications. If stretching incorrectly, some of the complications you may run into include infections, blowouts, and if you don't know what a blowout is when the fistula, so the tube of scar tissue that I mentioned earlier, gets pushed out through the other side of the piercing. It happens when you don't allow enough time between stretches for the fistula to gradually loosen, and because it's not loose enough to allow for the next size of jewelry, it instead just gets pushed out through the piercing, and it can cause pretty serious injuries. It can get infected, and you quite often need surgery to fix it. Moving on to some other complications, you can also have unevenly stretched lobes, especially when you're wearing tapers as jewelry. Wearing porous jewelry in a fresh stretch can result in the skin bonding to the jewelry, which then requires surgical removal. You can also experience tissue tearing when you try to stretch too quickly. And last but most certainly not least, you may also encounter tissue death, which usually happens when you try to stretch your ears larger than what your lobes will naturally accommodate, and so basically blood supply gets cut off because the tissue gets so thin, and the tissue just starts dying. All of these things sound pretty nasty, and that's because they are, but I'm not telling you about them to try to scare you or discourage you from stretching. I'm just trying to get across that this body modification and going through the process properly and safely needs to be taken seriously. If you can't stretch properly, and by that I mean if you don't have all of the correct tools and materials and jewelry and all of that, if you can't stretch properly, simply don't do it and wait until you can do it properly. Just remember that it is your responsibility to educate yourself on this process. So if you jump into ear stretching and you permanently fuck up your ears because you didn't know what you were doing, you didn't do your research, and you didn't listen to people who were telling you how to do it properly, you have no one to blame but yourself. So research, educate yourself. Knowledge is good. And on that note, that is the end of this episode. The next episode will be all about the different types of tools, jewelry, and materials, and that will be up tomorrow. So stay tuned for that. Follow me at these places to keep up with what I'm doing, and subscribe to this channel to be given a heads up when I upload my next video, and I will see you tomorrow.